One of the very first things that we teach kids, little kids, once they're able to speak, is, hey, use your words. Right? They start melting down, and we try to help them name what is happening inside of them. Like, what is going on? Are you sad? Are you angry? Are you scared? Like, are you hungry? Right? Is that just what's going on? I need you to take a deep breath for just 1 second and tell me what's happening inside of you. Now, part of that is because we genuinely care and we want to understand what's going on inside of them, but part of it is also because they're crying in the middle of Target, everybody stops shopping, and we want to do as best as we can to help this come to a peaceful and swiftful conclusion, right? And so we teach kids to name their emotions. At some point, someone even made an emotion wheel. Check this thing out. This is just one of many that I could find. Yeah, it's a lot. That is overwhelming just to even begin to look at. Right? Apparently, there are dozens of words available to describe what is happening inside a human being at any given moment. But as adults, we have narrowed down the list to 3 socially acceptable answers. When someone asks, "How are you?" the answers are good, tired, or fine. And fine might be the least useful of all of them because fine actually usually doesn't mean anything but fine. Right, someone asks, "How are you?" Probably happened on the way in this morning, and you respond, "Good, how are you?" And the speed of the return question is important, right? Because if you return it to them quick enough, then there is not enough time for a follow-up question to really hone in on how you are doing and turn it back on you. Right? We have a joke in our house that fine is a 4-letter word, and it is not particularly a clever joke, because fine is indeed actually a 4-letter word, but we mean it in the other sense. It's one of those words, right? We've seen enough versions of "I'm fine" to know that it doesn't always mean fine. And you can tell by the context in which it's said, right? Fine, followed by slamming the car door shut and storming off, it's not actually fine. Right? Fine, followed by turning around and storming away, again, not fine. And then we have the text message version with "okay" with a period, right? It's amazing what a short, grammatically correct sentence can mean in a text message, the way that can feel. And so the funny part is that we spend years teaching children to use their words, and then adulthood teaches us to keep functioning without them or moving over them quickly and not addressing them. We learn how to continue working while something inside of us is tired, angry, disappointed, or scared. And maybe nothing feels overwhelming in any of that. And even if it did, things still have to get done, so we just keep moving. There's actually a name in psychology for this, for putting a name to a feeling or putting feeling into words. It's called affect labeling. And research suggests that simply naming a negative feeling can help lower the distress that is connected to it. Now, naming it doesn't fix the marriage, right? It doesn't change the diagnosis or make a difficult conversation disappear, but it allows us to honestly deal with it and what's happening inside instead of only reacting to something that you have refused to acknowledge. Does that make sense? And I think that is part in why what makes Jesus' words in Matthew 11 so interesting and attractive to people. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus is teaching, and he says this, "Then Jesus said, 'Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest.'" Now, these words right here might be some of the most familiar words that Jesus has ever spoken. Right? Perhaps you didn't even know that it was that Jesus said it. Maybe you didn't even know that was in the Bible, but I would be willing to bet that at some point in time in life, you have heard or seen some version of those words. Right? And there's a good reason that we hold on to them. Right? Those words are very attractive. Right? I think one of the reasons why we are drawn to this and we are pulled in by this is because all of us are holding on to this belief. We want to believe that rest is available somewhere. Right? Another word that I would put to this that I think is actually behind what we're looking for is peace. But this is a promise that Jesus teaches, and that promise, right, it also can create a difficult question for us. Because some of us, some of you in the room, right, you have been coming to Jesus. Right? You have prayed, you have served, you have done your best to live faithfully, and yet you still find yourself tired. Right? The marriage is difficult. That you still don't know how to help your child. You are still praying for your adult children who don't believe. The grief did not disappear. You are still praying for the blessing of children. And all of that's going on, right? And then you're at the beginning of a school year, and the teachers are not waiting for you to catch your breath before that first big assignment is due or that friend group starts causing drama. And so what do you do with Jesus saying, "Come to me and I will give you rest," when you are doing your best to come to him and yet you do not feel rested? Like, okay, Jesus, I'm here. Where's the rest? Right? Either Jesus gave us a nice, pithy saying that does not hold up particularly well under the weight of real life, or, and I think this is more likely, we may have misunderstood what Jesus is doing here in this moment and what Jesus is offering. And so, in order for us to be able to understand this sentence, which is one of the most popular sentences that Jesus said, we have to look at the context with which it is said. We cannot pull one verse out all by itself. We need to see what was happening around when Jesus said it. Right? This is one of the ways that we can get ourselves into trouble with the Bible. We find a sentence we need, we're looking for hope, we pull it out of everything that's going on around it, and we cling to it. And usually, we're not trying to misuse the Bible. We're tired, we're scared, right? Maybe we wouldn't put those words to it necessarily, but I think we're looking for something hopeful. But if we never ask why Jesus said something or what was happening when he said it, we can expect him to promise something that he never actually promised. "Come to me and I will give you rest" does not appear all by itself. So we have to back up. And in order to understand why Jesus ends up saying this, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning of Matthew chapter 11, and this is what we find. Starting in verse 2, it reads like this. "John the Baptist, who was in prison, heard about all the things that the Messiah was doing. And so he, John the Baptist, sent his disciples, his students, to ask Jesus, 'Are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else?'" And just to be clear, Messiah was not simply a religious title for some really important person. They, the Israelites, had been waiting for God's promised king. And the title they gave that was Messiah, the one that God would send to rescue his people and set things right. So John the Baptist is not some casual observer who was just like looking for a religious guru, right? He's not trying to decide what he thinks about Jesus. John had actually built his entire life around preparing the way for Jesus, for them to recognize, hey, this is the guy that we have been looking for. And after John has done all of that, spent his entire life in service to what God has asked him to do, he finds himself in prison. And he's hearing reports about what Jesus is doing, and what he hears, what John hears, does not completely match up to what John thinks Jesus should be doing. It doesn't match up completely to what John expected. And we don't know everything that's happening inside of John, right? So I don't want to make his question say more than it does here. But what we do know is his circumstances did not look much like victory. He'd spent his entire life preparing people for the way of Jesus, doing what God asked him to do, and now he's sitting in prison. And so John sends some of his students, his disciples, to ask Jesus an honest question. Are you really the guy? Are you the one? And what I love about this is Jesus doesn't shame John for asking, right? What does he, when we read the rest of the chapter, what he does is he points John to what is happening, that people are being healed, dead are being raised, good news is reaching people that everybody else ignored. And then he sends John's disciples back to him with that message. And as they are walking away, Jesus turns to the crowd, and you might expect Jesus to say something like, man, I really thought John would be further along in his faith than that. Right? I really thought John would get this. That's what you would expect, but Jesus does the opposite. In fact, he actually starts bragging on John. Look at the first part of verse 11. He says this, I tell you the truth. This is Jesus speaking about John after he asks that difficult question. He says, I tell you the truth. Of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist. John's question did not remove or erase his faithfulness. A real question brought honestly to Jesus is not the same thing as a heart that is closed itself to Jesus. And after Jesus says this about John, remember now, all of this is driving us to verse 28. After Jesus says this about John, the rest of the chapter shows us, Jesus demonstrates what it looks like for a heart to be closed to Jesus. In verses 16 through 19, Jesus compares the people of the generation to children playing a game in the public square. They complain that because no one will play the game the way they want the game to be played. And then he goes on and he talks about how John lived a strict life, John the Baptist lived a strict life, but Jesus would hang out and eat with people that looked nothing like them, and that meant something was wrong with Jesus too. So John was too strict, Jesus was not enough. John was too serious, Jesus was not serious enough. And so when you read the story, what we begin to see happening is that they had already decided what God was supposed to look like. And what that meant was that no matter who God put in front of them, they found a reason to dismiss it. And it gets right at the heart of why this matters for what we're talking about in this Recovering Recess series. Jesus keeps calling people to become like children, but he's not asking us to become childish. Right? One of the things that we have always prayed for our kids is that they would stay curious and that they would love to ask questions, that they would have a love of learning. What I did not realize as a dad was how many questions that meant I would need to ask and that I was signing up for. But kids have this way of where they are willing to ask you something enormous, right? Why people die, why do bad things happen, like something you were absolutely not prepared for while you're in the middle of making a half peanut butter sandwich with the crust cut off, right? And then they are more comfortable admitting when we say, hey, it's complicated, or hey, I don't know. They're more okay going, I don't understand yet. And then they go back to playing with their Legos. Right? They don't have to understand everything before they stay open to it. And that's the difference of what's happening here in Matthew chapter 11. Childish says, Jesus, I need you to do this the way I think you should. Childlike says, Jesus, maybe there's something I don't understand yet. Jesus, maybe you know something I don't, and I'm okay with that. And then Jesus turns his warnings towards the towns where he had performed many of his miracles. Verse 20, he says this, then Jesus began to denounce the towns where he had done so many of his miracles because they hadn't repented, they hadn't turned from their sins and turned to God. So that their problem was not only that they had never seen enough evidence, they had seen the evidence. They had seen what Jesus was doing, and they still refused to change. Then, over the next 4 verses, Jesus highlights some specific cities with specific points and specific things that they saw, but still chose to remain closed off to Jesus. And his point is that seeing more of Jesus does not automatically mean someone is receptive to Jesus. In other words, you can be close to God and still remain closed to what God is trying to do in you. And then finally we reach verse 25. And I love as this first verse it says, at that time, after John's question, because it's like in the middle of all this, Jesus is denouncing these cities, and all of a sudden it says, and at that time, and he's in the middle of the crowd's criticism, and the entire town's refusing to change. Jesus turns his attention to the Father, and in a surprising way, like he begins to pray. So verse 25 and 26, he says this. At that time, so in the middle of this speech, at that time, Jesus prayed this prayer, "O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, thank you for hiding these things from those who think themselves wise and clever," and here it is, "and for revealing them to the childlike. Yes, Father, it pleased you to do it this way." Jesus thanks God for revealing these things to the childlike. And the childlike are not people who lack intelligence, not people who never ask difficult questions, right? In this moment, in this story, John asked a difficult question. But here the childlike are people that remain receptive enough to admit that they do not already see everything clearly. They are willing to receive what Jesus reveals instead of demanding that he work according to their expectations. And then verse 27, he says, "My Father has entrusted everything to me. No one truly knows the Son except the Father, and no one truly knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." Now, this is not simply a lesson about becoming more emotionally aware or trusting whatever is happening inside of you. Right, what happens here in this story, Jesus makes a much bigger claim than that. He says that he is the one who reveals the Father. So in everyday language, he's saying if you want to know what God actually looks like, you have to pay attention to Jesus. Jesus is not guessing about who God is or guessing at giving us his best interpretation of God. He's saying, I know God, and he is showing us what God looks like and how God wants us to operate in this world. And after all of that, Jesus gives us our promise and says, "Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest." The invitation that Jesus is making in that is for people to stay receptive to him. And John gives us a picture of what life can look like when life does not go the way that you expected. Right? John doesn't pretend that everything is fine, but he also doesn't let disappointment become the final answer either. He brings his honest question to Jesus. And so, the first week we talked about being willing to receive. Last week we talked about getting off of the hill, getting off the ladder, humility. And now we have to move in and we have to start talking about the day that you stopped playing. Right? There's a moment, I would say, for all of us, where there was a day where we began to shut ourselves off to something that we loved. Maybe the day that you stopped playing wasn't simply the day you got older. Maybe it was the day something hurt badly enough that you decided you already know how the story would end, and so you stopped trusting Jesus with that part. Right? And once you decided how you knew it would end, you stopped bringing that part of your life to Jesus. You kept functioning. You may have even kept following Jesus in other areas of your life, but that one part of your heart became a place where you no longer expected him to surprise you and care for you. And what happens, if you stay in that place long enough, something begins to form in that part of your heart. A callus. We have a ninja course hanging from the ceiling of our basement here at our house. And you might ask, well, why in the world do you have a ninja course hanging from the ceiling in your basement? To which I would reply, why would you not have a ninja course hanging from the ceiling in your basement? All right, because the point was to give our kids somewhere to run and play when it was raining and they were stuck inside. And when we first hung this up, my kids went down there, man, and they spent a ton of time swinging from the handles, grabbing the rope, hanging upside down, playing the floor is lava, and coming up with all kinds of different games to play. And I will admit to you, I did as well. And I quickly learned I am not as strong and limber as I once was, but gave it a shot. But after the first day, kids came upstairs, it was time for bed, and sure enough, you know what they started complaining about? They started complaining that their hands were hurting. That the handles were rubbing their palms, and the rope was rough, and everything down there seemed designed to remove the first several layers of skin from a child's hand. And what I told my kids is that it will hurt for a while, enough until calluses will form, to which led to the question, well, what's a callus? And I explained that their hands had to learn to protect themselves. The skin would become thicker, and eventually that same rope that they're playing on now would not hurt as much. Right? It forms because that same place experienced pressure or friction over and over and over again. And your body learns to protect the place by making the skin thicker and less sensitive. And the protection works. It's the whole point. But reduced sensitivity ends up being the cost. And what I've found, and what my experience has been, is that the same thing can begin to happen inside of us. Right? Is people usually do not become calloused because they stopped caring. People become calloused because caring kept hurting. You hoped something would change and it didn't. You trusted somebody with that deep, intimate part of you and they broke that trust. And eventually, you learned how to protect that place. And the difficult part is that that protection may have helped you for a while. But what protects you from pain can eventually keep you from receiving anything good and make you less sensitive to what other people around you are carrying. To where your spouse tells you something hurts, and immediately you defend rather than trying to understand. A child is scared, and you had to learn, you call it drama, but you had to learn a long time ago that you just need to push through the fear, and so you assume it is time for them to learn that same lesson. Someone trusts you with something heavy, and you hand them your version of suck it up, buttercup, because sitting with their pain makes you uncomfortable, and it slows you down from what you're trying to accomplish. Right? There are moments where we have to keep moving when we hurt. Feelings cannot make every decision for us, and obedience sometimes means doing the right thing before you feel ready, but strength is not pretending that nothing is happening inside of you. What is happening inside of you, which is what we've talked about a lot in this series, what is happening inside of you eventually finds its way out of you, and often it lands on the people closest to you. And that's why our memory proverb this week matters. So, quick check. Week 1 was trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. Week 2, last week, was pride leads to disgrace, but with humility comes honor. And this week, the Proverbs that we're challenging you to memorize is Proverbs 4:23. It's the New International Version that says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And my hope is that we are actually you are getting these in your head, not because there's going to be a quiz at the end of the series that would be a very different kind of church, but because that sometimes you need truth before you have time to go looking for it. And this one is a picture of a spring. And what it says is your heart is a spring and your life flows from your heart. And guarding your heart is not shutting it down, right? You do not protect a spring by pouring concrete over it. Right? There may be people, though, that you should not have the same access to you, right? Becoming tender does not mean removing wise boundaries or placing yourself back into an unsafe situation. But you can keep a necessary boundary without keeping Jesus at a distance. And so I want to take a moment and have you ask yourself, where has a callus formed in me? Right? I feel like every time we open up the pages of Scripture, there is something Jesus is challenging us to grow and do. One of the things we say around here about being a follower, being a student of Jesus, is that we are training our lives to match the rhythms and teachings of Jesus. And so when we crack open the Scriptures, when we crack open the Bible, every time we should be able to ask the question, okay, what is God asking me to do? And I would think the question that we need to ask in this morning is, where has a callus formed in me? And then I think a follow-up question that's important for us to ask and wrestle with is, what did that callus protect me from then? And who is it hurting now? Right? It may not be hurting anyone around you, but it may be hurting you. Like, what is it keeping you from now? And this is why I think it's really important to remember the context with which Jesus says, verse 28 in chapter 11, is that Jesus does not shame the part of you that has become calloused. He simply says, come to me. And this is why we have to pay attention to what Jesus says after he says, come to me. We're drawn to the invitation because we know that we need rest, but if we stop there, if we stop after the first sentence, we can misunderstand what he's offering. And so here is everything that Jesus says to close out this section of teachings. So then, after all of that context, Jesus said, come to me, all who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. Now, what I love about this section of Scripture is the thing that we are looking for, the rest, the peace. Jesus actually promises us twice here. Right? And that means the rest that Jesus offers is not passive. Because when you look at it, right, there's an action step in between it. Because between those two promises, he tells us to take his yoke and learn from him. Right? And so this rest that he's offering is not a passive rest. It's not an escape from responsibility or a promise that nothing difficult is going to happen in life. Right? Jesus doesn't offer us a life with nothing to carry. He offers us and teaches us a different way to carry it. A yoke was a familiar picture for them of submitting to someone's instruction and their way of life. And Jesus is saying, let me become your teacher. Let me begin shaping your ways. And the reality is, all of us in the room are carrying life under some kind of yoke. There is some kind of yoke that you are carrying in approaching life. Fear tells us how to respond. Other people's expectation tell us what matters. Cynicism teaches us not to hope. And Jesus says here, there's another way to live. There is something else that you can experience. His way will still ask something of us. Following Jesus does involve obedience. It involves responsibility. It involves change. But what he says is his way is not cruel. It does not grind you down to someone to make someone else feel important. And I love that he says, and what we see here is that, and the person that's teaching you is gentle and humble at heart. And that matters because if someone is claiming to represent Jesus, if someone claiming to represent Jesus has ever told you something true in a way that did not feel gentle or humble, right, they weren't really representing Jesus very well. And what they may have said may have been true, but it didn't represent Jesus well. Right? People can misrepresent Jesus while using his words. And so we have to pay attention how Jesus describes himself. And he's asking you to bring him a place that has already been hurt. He will tell us the truth about that place, but he will not crush us with it. And Jesus says, hey, come close enough to learn from me. And that's why we talk about matching our lives to the rhythms and teachings of Jesus. We pay attention to how Jesus lives and practice what he teaches, and we stay close enough to keep learning from him. So, here is a childlike step I want to ask you to take this week. What have you stopped bringing to Jesus because you think you already know how the story ends? And I want to challenge you to bring back that part, to bring back that hurt and to talk to Jesus about it. Right? You do not have to pretend you trust Jesus more than you do. Tell him the honest version of what happened and why you are scared to hope again. And then I want you to ask this application, once that thing gets brought up inside of you. If you trusted Jesus with that thing, what would you do next? And I would encourage you not to try and fix your entire life in an afternoon, but to this week to take one obedient step, which might mean asking for help. It might mean finally researching and making that counseling appointment. It might mean engaging in the conversation that you've been avoiding, or receiving care without immediately stiff-arming it because you don't want to look like you don't have it all together. And honestly, this is why groups matter, right? Definitely not because you just need another thing on your calendar, right? I mean, we've all got full calendars. But sometimes the way Jesus helps make us tender again is through people who have walked through something similar and can stay with us in it as we begin to let that callous part of our heart heal. You don't need everybody to know your entire story, but you will need a few people who know enough of it to listen, pray, and encourage you and help you keep bringing that part of your life back to Jesus. And if your next step is finding some people to walk with you, you can put that on your connection card. You can tap the dot. You can come talk to me in the lobby. I want to help get you connected to a group of people that is running after Jesus and can walk with you through whatever it is you are walking through. And that step that we're looking at this week, it's not going to be the same for everybody. But the point is to stop letting the callous make the decision for you. Is to remove that callous. And I want you to know something before we step into any of this, right? If you've ever had big calluses on your hands, sooner or later one ends up getting torn off. And what happens when it comes off? That skin underneath is pretty sensitive, isn't it? It's incredibly tender for a while, which makes sense because that place has been protected from feeling much of anything for a very long time. And as you wade into this, that same thing can happen here. Right? You may finally start bringing something back to Jesus and realize that it still hurts more than you thought. You may have the conversation, ask for help, begin going to counseling, or maybe you begin letting yourself hope again, and suddenly you feel a lot more than you did when you were keeping that place guarded. I want to let you know that doesn't mean that you're doing this wrong. But I also want to call you to remember who we are trying to lean into. Because Jesus says, I am gentle and humble at heart. And so please do not beat yourself up because the place becoming tender is still tender. Jesus isn't rushing you. He's not shaming you. He's not standing over you, asking you, why are you not further along already? He is inviting you to come close enough to learn from him. And so every week we got a proverb, and every week there's a prayer I want to challenge you to pray. And this week, this is the prayer I want to challenge you to pray. Jesus, please make tender what life has made calloused. And if that feels scary to pray, I want to invite you to tell him that as well. In fact, we're going to go ahead and we're going to close out, and I want to close with that kind of prayer that I'm asking you to pray this week. So will you pray with me? God, we love you. Jesus, there are places inside of me that still hurt. And there are ways that I have learned to push over and callous over them so that I can move through and function. But God, I know that what ends up happening is that I move on from your people in ways that cause further hurt for them. And so, God, this morning, I'm asking you to show up. God, to bring to mind places of our childlike heart that we have let become calloused, where we just move over people's stories instead of caring for and intentionally paying attention to them because we are afraid of what has happened and what happens when we let that part of our heart get trusted and it got hurt before. And so, God, as we go out of here this week, God, I want us to reflect your love in an entire way that honors you. God, because you said that the best way for us to love God is by how we love your people, which is the people we come in contact with. God, and in order for us to be able to do that, we have to have a heart that is not calloused. And so, God, would you bring to mind for us the moments where we had moved on from and we have learned to protect in ways that you wouldn't have us do. And God, once you bring that place to mind, would you give us wisdom for what to do with that? And then because it's scary, God, would you give us the guts to go and do something with it? God, thank you so much for Jesus. Thank you so much that he is gentle and humble at heart. God, would you please help us to trust that this week? It's in your Son's holy and awesome, amazing, wonderful name we pray. Amen.